The past. When I first moved into the old building, I was captivated by its charm. The faded brick exterior, the wrought iron balconies, and the vintage elevator all spoke of a bygone era. I was starting a new job in a new city, and the rent was affordable. The only drawback was the building's eerie reputation and the mysterious old woman who lived on the top floor. Mrs. Agnes Sinclair was the building's oldest resident. She had lived there for over 50 years, watching tenants come and go. I met her on my second day while retrieving my mail. Her eyes were a piercing blue, and her thin lips curved into a knowing smile. She warned me to respect the building and its history, but I brushed it off as the ramblings of an eccentric old woman. The first night in my new apartment was restless. Strange noises echoed through the halls, creaking floorboards, distant whispers, and what sounded like footsteps pacing back and forth. I chalked it up to the building settling and the neighbors. But as the night wore on, the noises grew louder, almost as if they were coming from inside my apartment. The following days were uneventful, and I began to settle into my new routine. One evening, while unpacking, I noticed something odd. Items in my apartment seemed to move independently, a picture frame tilted, a book out of place. At first, I thought I was imagining things, but the occurrences became too frequent to ignore. I decided to ask Mrs. Sinclair about the building's history. She invited me into her apartment, filled with antiques and old photographs. She spoke of a tragic past, a fire that had claimed several lives decades ago. The spirits of those who perished, she claimed, still lingered in the building. Her words sent chills down my spine. One night, I woke to find a figure standing at the foot of my bed. It was a young woman, pale and expressionless, dressed in old-fashioned clothes. I blinked, and she vanished. I was too terrified to move, my heart pounding in my chest. I spent the rest of the night wide awake, watching the shadows dance on the walls. Determined to understand what was happening, I delved into the building's history. The fire Mrs. Sinclair mentioned had occurred in the 1920s, killing several residents. Among them was a young woman named Emily, whose ghostly figure matched the apparition I had seen. The more I read, the more I felt a connection to her tragic story. Mrs. Sinclair sensed my growing obsession and warned me to be careful. She claimed that Emily's spirit was restless and that my curiosity could provoke her. I tried to heed her warning, but my need for answers overpowered my fear. I continued my research, uncovering details about the other victims and the circumstances of the fire. I decided to conduct a séance, hoping to communicate with Emily and the other spirits. I invited a few friends, and we gathered in my dimly lit living room. We joined hands and called out to the spirits. The air grew cold, and the candle flames flickered. Suddenly, the table shook, and a ghostly whisper filled the room, "Help us." After the séance, I began having vivid dreams. Emily appeared to me, pleading for help. She showed me glimpses of her life before the fire and the moments leading up to the tragedy. I felt an overwhelming sense of sorrow and a need to free her spirit. I shared my experiences with Mrs. Sinclair, who surprisingly offered to help. Mrs. Sinclair and I started investigating the cause of the fire. We discovered that it had been intentionally set by the building's original owner, Mr. Whitaker, to collect insurance money. The spirits of Emily and the other victims were trapped, seeking justice for their untimely deaths. We decided to find evidence to expose the truth. We scoured the building, searching for clues. In the basement, hidden behind a false wall, we found old ledgers and documents proving Whitaker's guilt. Among them was a confession letter, written in a moment of remorse but never sent. We knew this evidence could finally bring peace to the restless spirits. As we prepared to present our findings to the authorities, the paranormal activity in the building escalated. The spirits were agitated, aware that justice was near. One night, while I was alone, Emily appeared again, her expression more desperate than ever. "Hurry," she whispered, before vanishing into thin air. We handed over the evidence to the local historical society, shocked by the discovery. They promised to investigate and ensure that the truth was brought to light. In the meantime, Mrs. Sinclair and I continued to experience intense paranormal phenomena, as if the spirits were anxiously awaiting their release. Mrs. Sinclair suggested performing a ritual to help the spirits move on. She believed that by acknowledging their pain and promising justice, we could free them. We gathered in the building's courtyard, where the fire had started. As we recited the ritual, a sense of calm washed over the area, and the oppressive atmosphere lifted. For a few days, the building was eerily quiet. The whispers ceased, and the shadows no longer moved on their own. I thought the spirits had finally found peace, but Mrs. Sinclair warned that it was not over. The ritual had calmed them, but the final release would only come when Whitaker's guilt was publicly acknowledged. The Historical Society organized a public event to reveal the findings. The media coverage was extensive, and the story of the fire and Whitaker's treachery became widely known. As the truth spread, the building breathed a sigh of relief. That night, I dreamed of Emily one last time. She smiled and thanked me before fading away. With the spirits at peace, life in the building returned to normal. Mrs. Sinclair and I grew closer, bonding over our shared experience. She confided in me that she had always felt a connection to the spirits and was grateful for the closure we had brought. I felt a sense of accomplishment and a newfound appreciation for the history around me. The building became a historical landmark, with plaques commemorating the victims and the story of the fire. Visitors often asked about paranormal activity, and I shared my experiences with them, honoring the spirit's memory. The once haunted building now stood as a testament to the resilience of its residents and the power of truth. As time passed, new tenants moved in, unaware of the building's dark past. I stayed, feeling a deep connection to the place that had become my home. The paranormal activities had ceased, but the lessons I learned and the bonds I formed remained. The old building, with its tragic history, had given me a sense of purpose and belonging. The shadows of the past had finally been laid to rest, and I looked forward to the future with hope and gratitude. The shadows. I never thought I'd end up in an old, dilapidated building in the heart of the city. But after losing my job and needing a cheap place to live, I found myself moving into the top floor of a creaky, ancient apartment complex. The landlord, a frail old man named Mr. Whitaker, lived in the basement. He seemed harmless, though something about his piercing blue eyes unsettled me. Mr. Whitaker was oddly spry for his age, appearing in unexpected places around the building. He welcomed me with a weak smile and warned me about the quirks of the old structure. Sometimes, the pipes make strange noises, and the lights flicker, he said. Don't let it worry you. His words, meant to comfort, only heightened my anxiety. That first night was restless. I lay awake, listening to the groans of the building settling and the occasional scurrying of rats. Around midnight, I heard footsteps outside my door, slow and deliberate. My heart pounded in my chest as I tiptoed to the peephole. There was no one there, but the footsteps continued, fading away into silence. Over the next few days, strange things started happening. Doors creaked open, and I'd find objects in different places than where I'd left them. One evening, I heard a faint whispering coming from the walls. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, but the feeling of being watched never left me. While exploring the building's dusty attic, I stumbled upon an old photograph. It depicted Mr. Whitaker standing next to a woman and a child, both of whom looked eerily familiar. The photo was dated 1923. It didn't make sense. That would make Mr. Whitaker over 100 years old. I decided to confront him about it. Mr. Whitaker was evasive when I showed him the photograph. His eyes, normally so cold, flashed with anger and fear. Some things are better left in the past, he muttered before shuffling away. His reaction only fueled my curiosity. There was something deeply wrong with this place, and I was determined to find out what. I took the photograph to the local library and began researching the building's history. It had been constructed in the early 1900s and was initially a grand hotel. There were reports of several mysterious disappearances and deaths over the years, including a woman and her child in the 1920s. The more I read, the more I realized that the building's dark past was far from over. That night, the haunting escalated. I woke to a child's laughter echoing through the hallways. The temperature in my apartment plummeted, and my breath came out in frosty puffs. Shadows danced on the walls, taking on nightmarish shapes. In the midst of it all, I saw a figure standing at the foot of my bed, a woman in a tattered dress, her eyes hollow and dark. The apparitions became more frequent and vivid. I saw the woman and child from the photograph everywhere, in mirrors, reflected in windows, standing at the end of dark hallways. They never spoke, but their presence was suffocating. I started to doubt my sanity, wondering if I was imagining it all. One evening, Mr. Whitaker appeared at my door, his face ashen. "You need to leave," he said urgently. "This place, it feeds on fear and despair. It won't let you go easily." His words sent a chill down my spine. He wouldn't explain further, but his fear was palpable. I decided to heed his warning and began packing my things. As I packed, the building seemed to come alive. The lights flickered wildly, and the walls shook as if in protest. The whispers grew louder, almost deafening. When I reached the front door, it refused to open. It was as if the building itself was trapping me inside. Panic set in as I realized that leaving might not be as simple as I had hoped. Desperate for answers, I decided to confront Mr. Whitaker again. I made my way to the basement, a place I had avoided until then. The air was thick with an oppressive darkness. I found Mr. Whitaker sitting in a small, dimly lit room surrounded by old books and strange symbols. He looked up at me with a resigned expression. Mr. Whitaker finally confessed. He was a caretaker, bound to the building by a curse placed upon him decades ago. The woman and child in the photograph were his wife and daughter, victims of a dark ritual meant to extend his life. The building demanded sacrifices, feeding on the souls of its inhabitants. "I've been trying to contain it, but it's growing stronger," he said. "I'm sorry." Mr. Whitaker revealed a way to break the curse, but it required a sacrifice. Someone had to willingly take his place as the building's caretaker. The idea was abhorrent, but it was the only way to free myself and the spirits trapped within. I felt a mixture of fear and resolve as I agreed to help him perform the ritual. We spent the next few days preparing for the ritual. Mr. Whitaker showed me how to draw protective symbols and gather the necessary items. The building seemed to sense our intentions, growing increasingly hostile. Shadows lurked around every corner, and the whispers turned to angry shouts. My resolve wavered, but I knew there was no turning back. The night of the ritual arrived. We gathered in the basement, where Mr. Whitaker had drawn a large circle inscribed with ancient runes. As we began the incantation, the building shook violently. The temperature dropped, and a piercing wail filled the air. The spirits of the woman and child appeared, their faces twisted in agony. Mr. Whitaker stepped into the circle, his face lined with determination and sorrow. He chanted the final words of the incantation, and the symbols began to glow. The spirits surged forward, but the protective circle held them at bay. With a final, agonized scream, Mr. Whitaker collapsed. The building groaned as if in pain, and the oppressive darkness lifted slightly. For a brief moment, there was a sense of calm. The spirits had receded, and the building felt less malevolent. But I knew it wasn't over. I had to complete the ritual by taking Mr. Whitaker's place as the caretaker. As I prepared to do so, I felt a sense of acceptance. This was the only way to ensure the safety of future inhabitants. Just as I was about to complete the ritual, the building fought back with a final, desperate surge of energy. Shadows lunged at me, and the whispers became a cacophony of screams. I struggled to maintain the protective circle, chanting the incantation with all my strength. The spirits of the woman and child appeared once more, but this time, they seemed hopeful. With a final burst of energy, I completed the ritual. The shadows dissolved, and the whispers faded into silence. The spirits of the woman and child smiled before disappearing into a bright light. The building, now free of its malevolent force, felt lighter. I collapsed to the floor, exhausted but relieved. I was the new caretaker, but I had succeeded in breaking the curse. The building was now just an old structure, free from its dark past. As I looked around, I knew that I had saved not just myself but countless others from the horrors that had plagued it for so long. The walls. When I found the old building listed at a bargain price, I couldn't believe my luck. It was a dilapidated 3-story structure on the outskirts of town, perfect for the art studio and living space I needed. The real estate agent mentioned that the previous owners had left abruptly, but I was too excited to care. The building was mine within a week. As I moved in, I met Mrs. Thorne, the building's sole occupant for 30 years. She was an elderly woman with sharp blue eyes and a weathered face, but she moved with a grace that belied her age. She warned me to be careful, claiming the building had a way of holding on to its residents. I dismissed her words as the ramblings of a lonely old lady. The first night in my new home was peaceful until midnight. I woke to faint whispers, too quiet to make out the words. I assumed it was just the building settling and went back to sleep. But the whispers continued every night, growing louder and more insistent. Exploring the building, I found a room on the 3rd floor that was locked tight. The key was nowhere to be found, and the door seemed ancient, covered in strange symbols. Mrs. Thorne saw me trying to open it and shook her head. "Some doors are best left closed," she said cryptically. While cleaning out the basement, I discovered a collection of old portraits. They depicted stern-looking individuals with lifeless eyes, each more unsettling than the last. As I examined them, I felt their eyes were following me. I brought one upstairs, intending to hang it in the hallway, but the uneasy feeling persisted. One evening, as I worked late into the night, I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. Shadows darted across the walls, faster than any person could move. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, but the feeling of being watched grew stronger with each passing day. Mrs. Thorne's warnings became more urgent. She told me about the building's dark history, how it had been a boarding house in the 1800s, and how many residents had mysteriously disappeared. "This place is alive," she whispered, "and it feeds on fear." I couldn't tell if she was serious or simply trying to scare me, but her words left a lingering unease. I started having vivid nightmares of the building's past. I saw flashes of people being dragged into the walls, their screams echoing in the darkness. Each morning, I woke up drenched in sweat, the images seared into my mind. The whispers at night turned into anguished cries. Determined to uncover the truth, I began researching the building's history. I found old newspaper articles about the boarding house, detailing a series of gruesome murders and unexplained disappearances. The last article mentioned Edward Blackwood, who was believed to be responsible but vanished before he could be apprehended. One night, I heard a loud crash from the 3rd floor. Armed with a flashlight, I ventured upstairs. The locked door was now slightly ajar. I pushed it open, revealing a room with old furniture covered in dust and cobwebs. At the center stood a tall, shadowy figure. It turned towards me, its eyes glowing with light. I fled downstairs, heart pounding. The encounters became more frequent. I saw the shadowy figure in mirrors, reflected in windows, always watching me. Mrs. Thorne grew weaker, her health deteriorating rapidly. She claimed the building was draining her life force. Desperate, I sought help from a local paranormal expert, Dr. Evelyn Carter. Dr. Carter agreed to investigate the building. She brought equipment to measure electromagnetic activity and record any paranormal phenomena. As she set up her devices, the air grew thick with tension. Her instruments went haywire, detecting unusual energy spikes throughout the building. Dr. Carter suggested a seance to communicate with the spirits. Reluctantly, I agreed. We gathered in the living room, holding hands around a small table. Dr. Carter began chanting, and the room grew colder. The lights flickered, and we heard faint whispers. Suddenly, the table shook violently, and a deep, guttural voice spoke, "Leave this place or suffer the same fate." The voice revealed itself to be Edward Blackwood, who had vanished in the 1800s. He claimed he was trapped in the building, cursed to wander its halls for eternity. He had been trying to escape but needed a living soul to take his place. The portraits in the basement were of his previous victims, each one lured in by the building and consumed by its darkness. Determined to free the spirits and myself, I devised a plan with Dr. Carter. We would perform a ritual to break the curse, but it required the original key to the locked room, which Mrs. Thorne said was hidden in the building. As we searched, the shadows grew more aggressive, trying to thwart our efforts. We finally found the key hidden inside the frame of one of the portraits. Mrs. Thorne, too weak to join us, wished us luck. Dr. Carter and I unlocked the room and set up for the ritual. The air was thick, and the shadows swirled around us, whispering threats. As Dr. Carter chanted the incantations, the building shook violently. The shadows coalesced into the form of Edward Blackwood, his eyes burning with rage. He lunged at us, but we stood our ground, continuing the ritual. A blinding light filled the room, and the shadows screamed in agony. Blackwood's form solidified, and he attacked. I fought back, wielding a blessed artifact Dr. Carter had given me. The struggle was intense, but with the final words of the incantation, Blackwood let out a final, anguished cry and disintegrated into nothingness. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, and the building seemed to sigh in relief. The spirits of Blackwood's victims appeared, no longer tormented but grateful. They thanked us for freeing them before fading away. Mrs. Thorne passed away peacefully that night, her face serene. Dr. Carter and I sealed the locked room and ensured the cursed artifacts were properly disposed of. With the curse broken, the building felt different, almost welcoming. I renovated it, transforming it into the art studio and home I had envisioned. The whispers and shadows were gone, replaced by a sense of calm. I often thought of Mrs. Thorne and the spirits we had freed. The experience changed me, but I was ready to embrace my new beginning, knowing that the building's dark past had finally been put to rest.